Going live. We're live. Hi. So welcome everyone to September Open Days 2020. We are virtual again. We've got a few people with us. I'm just going to add Jamie Findley, who's here to represent Linguistics. So you'll see him pop up on the screen. And then there's Dave Leal here to represent Philosophy as tutor. We're live. Hi. So welcome everyone to September Open Days 2020. Sorry, we are virtual streaming again. Myself. We've got a few people with us. I'm just going to add Jamie Findley, who's here to represent Linguistics. So you'll see him. I don't know how to turn it off. And then there's Dave Leal here to represent. Okay, I've done it. I'm really sorry. I had it open in another window, so I just streamed everything. Try again. So maybe we do brief introductions and then we'll handle some of your questions. Okay, so Jamie, do you want to go first as a brand new arrival? Do you want to say who you are and what you're here for?
Is that this Jamie, not the other Jamie?
Yeah.
Cool. Yes, so hello, my name is Jamie Findley. I'm a lecturer in syntax in the linguistics department, and I'm also the one of their outreach and access officers. So I'm here to talk about the linguistics component of PPL.
Dave.
So Dave Leal, I teach philosophy in one of the colleges across pretty much the whole range of philosophical subjects. I'm one of the people who was involved in actually writing the PPL degree when that came in a few years ago. I was one of the people responsible for producing the scheme for that, and also quite involved in setting admissions tests and stuff. So could say a little bit about that later on if there are any questions on that.
Brilliant. So and I'm here then as a tutor that's representing psychology. So I'm an associate professor in psychology, and I coordinate the admissions process for both the EP and PPL. So that means we do central shortlisting. And so that's kind of my role here. So I'm happy to talk about stuff like that. So please do send us your questions in the Slido and we'll happily answer them. So, and then we're going to present some of our students. So do you want to go first, Corinne? You're in my top left corner.
Hi, I'm Corinne. I'm an experimental psychology graduate from St Anne's College. So I've just finished and now I'm moving on into work.
Brilliant. Safi?
Yeah, hi, I'm Safi. I'm going into my third year of experimental psychology at Wadham College.
Brilliant. And then Milena?
Hi, I'm Milena. I just graduated like Corinne, but I specialized in psychology and philosophy, and I was at a mature student college called Harris Manchester.
Brilliant. And then we've got Jamie. Other Jamie?
Hi, I'm Jamie Slagle, and I'm going into third year studying philosophy and linguistics at Jesus College.
Brilliant. So we thought maybe we'd start this live stream with talking a little bit about some of the changes that are happening this year. And we have a bit of a better idea now than we had in July. So for anyone planning to apply, so the deadline remains the 15th of October on your UCAS deadlines. If we go through shortlisting, so Dave will talk to you a little bit more about the TSA and changes that are happening there. But once past shortlisting, interviewing will be done remotely for us. So all interviewing for Oxford will be done remotely. And the way it's being set up is that it will be done ideally from your school. So we would be expecting you guys to go into schools and do the interviewing there so that all the technology can be set up for all the courses in the same way and for all the colleges in the same way, whichever one you're applying to. So you'll have a standard interview with us. So the way it's going to go for experimental psychology typically is that you would have 2 interviews, so 1 in each college, and similarly psychology and philosophy, you get interviewed in 2 different colleges, so there'll be 2 different interviews, and typically probably 2 per college. So 1 for psychology typically, and then philosophy 1 or linguistics 1. If there's more questions about this remote interviewing, please ask away and we'll try and address more specifics if you've got them. So I thought I'd just hand over to Dave now to talk a little bit about the changes for the TSA. I know that's probably on a lot of your minds. So Dave.
Okay, thank you. I should say that there's got to be a lot of subject to us discovering that things have changed as well going on here, and the TSA is very much one part of that. So the TSA will have exactly the same form as it's had in previous years. There'll be a section 1 that's multiple choice and a section 2 that's a half-hour essay. The half-hour bit may or may not survive, depending on whether it's decided that doing it on a computer screen is going to give extra time or not. But at the moment, and I had a look at the various websites this morning, and this is still the latest advice, 90 minutes for the multiple choice section to be done at a computer screen, and 30 minutes for the essay, the writing task, again done at a computing screen. So those will then be submitted online, which is a good thing because it stops lots of paper having to be handled, and that obviously would be a potential virus hazard. So that's one of the reasons why we're doing things this way. But it will have exactly the same format. What differences might there be for you in that? Well, one, of course, is doing it at a computer, which some people have always done. I mean, from the beginning of the TSA, a few people have done their tests on computers. Some people always do all their exams on computers, but that's not the case typically. And this year, we're going to ask everybody, or everybody who can. There might be special arrangements for people who absolutely can't use a computer for disability reasons or whatever. Then we need to make other arrangements. And you'll have, therefore, a word limit. This is something we've been talking about in the university in the past couple of weeks. There'll be a word limit, which for handwriting, there's simply a space limit. You've got 2 sides to write in. And we want the word limit to be a sensible one, but we want people who do the test to think of the limit as a limit and not as a target. So we don't want, if we say 750 words or 800 words, for you to think that's what you ought to be writing. So just to tell everybody that I looked at some very good TSA essays from previous years and did a word count on them just to give an idea of how long a good essay could be. And the answer was 450 to 550 words, something in that kind of range. You know, the essays that were getting 70 or above were typically that sort of length. Could be slightly shorter, certainly do not need to be any longer. So when you see a word limit, you can probably ignore it, because if you're doing the right thing, you won't get anywhere near it. You'll be spending time thinking and planning before you write, and the thinking and planning will take enough time that you'll probably not get anywhere above 600 words, and the limit's likely to be set a bit beyond that. Now, Neela, you're muted.
Trying to be good.
Yeah.
So just to confirm, they've asked, it will definitely be typed then. There will be no written essays.
Yeah, that's right. It's a typed, the plan is typed. Now, what we do not know, because this will depend on test centers and a whole variety of other things, is where the computer comes from. So there will be test centers that are already set up with banks of computers. There will be schools that are perfectly used to everybody sitting at tests on computers, or they have enough computers that they can provide a computer suite for people to go in and sit the test. And there may be other centers where people are asked to bring their own computer. And at the moment, I think that is a bit up in the air, and it's something that we don't have a definitive judgment on what will be allowed, what won't be allowed, and what will be normal and what won't be normal. So that's something very much to keep an eye on.
Yeah, the plan is definitely, as far as I understand it from Central, is to have by the 15th of October, so by the UCAS deadline, to have clear guidance that very specifically says this is exactly how it's going to go. So the digital test is meant to also allow remote assessment. So if someone, the plan is for there to be some sort of contingency in case people have to self-isolate if they can't go into the center. Dave, what's your understanding of the contingency plan for people who have to sit not in a center?
So this is about invigilation. It is something that we are promised is going to be available, but we are not expecting this to be very widely used. We're not expecting it at all to be the normal way for the test to be taken. It may be that something like asking you to project your screen as you are, or project from your camera as you are doing the test, and maybe then somebody centrally could invigilate 4 people at a time, looking at 4 of them on a screen at once. That would be just a guess about how it might go. But the honest truth is we've not seen a model as tutors. We haven't been given a model of how this is going to look. It's very important that something's in place, though, because it's extraordinarily likely, very highly likely, that there will be people who can't get into a centre because of travel or transport restrictions or for whatever other reason. And we do want people, as far as they possibly can, to actually take the test.
Yeah. If there's more specific questions on the TSA, please do drop us a line on the Slido and we'll happily address them. I've seen another question on the interviewing, which I'll just handle before I hand over to some others. So the question is, will applicants for EP have 1 or 2 interviews at each college? So the plan currently is for there just to be 1 interview at each college. And although previously that might have been different, with the current difficulties on trying to schedule all these online interviews, it's looking like it will be 1. But again, this will be very explicitly, clearly confirmed by the 15th of October. So everything is being put in place, and open day comes at the time when we are still trying to gather all the final information. But the current plan is it will be for EP, 1 at each college, and for PPL likely 2 at each college. But that's to be confirmed, but just so you have some idea.
And it's worth saying, perhaps adding to that, that colleges can interview more if they can arrange more. So it may be that we just have a slightly longer interviewing window, and I think that's something that's been under discussion as well. But we're still talking even about details of the interview timetable for the whole university.
Great. So maybe it might be worth a little question on, so there's been quite a few questions on type of subjects to study at A level. And if you've seen some of our videos, people have been talking about what they've done so far, and we'll answer some of those very specific questions also directly in the Slido. We thought it might be nice to hear a little bit student perspective, especially we've got 2 people who've just graduated, and we've kind of maybe, well, I was interested, and maybe you are as well, finding out what they're doing now and what's happening. So Corinne, do you want to come in and say what's happened to you since graduating?
Yeah, so I graduated a couple of months ago, and since then I've been job searching. So I'm looking at going into clinical psychology and applying for postgrad for that later on. So I've recently got a job at the National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, and that's a assistant psychologist position or neuropsychologist position. So mainly doing testing, neuropsychological testing and neurorehabilitation stuff with patients that have had traumatic brain injury or stroke. So that's my plan now.
Excellent. Milena, what are you doing?
Hello. Yeah, I'm going to start in October as the Junior Communications Advisor at a company or a member-led association called Solar Power Europe. And they deal with the EU Commission and various manufacturers of solar power, and also different policies and different EU member states regarding solar power usage. And I'll be in their communications team, which I'm really excited for. Yeah.
Cool. So everybody else who's been, so you guys had online exams, right, Corinne and Milena? And then Jamie and Safi, you've got them coming up. Maybe it's worth saying a little bit about how we're handling the online pandemic and exams. What's it looking like, and what's the difference to what it was? So maybe Jamie, are you planning? You've got exams.
I have
It doesn't.
exams at the end of this year.
Safi does.
Other Jamie, ignore me.
Safi, you've got exams coming up.
Yeah, in a few weeks, or about a week and a half. So they're going to be on in an online format and open book. So we'll have all of our notes available to us, and they've also cut out some of the sections. So before, where you would have multiple choice questions, it's like one section of the paper. They've cut that out, so it's all going to be essay based. And the same for the statistics exam. They've cut out the brief notes section, which would be more like definition based, so that we're working more on, say, the results output of a statistical test and interpreting that. So it is different to how it would usually be, which would be in person, on closed book. And it's also, yeah, so there's quite a few different changes in that way. I'm not sure if they're going to continue to keep that format next year. I know some subjects have decided that they will for even next year finals. But yeah, so that's a little bit of what it's going to entail.
Yeah, great. So I'm just reading one of the questions that's come in and says, I love the idea that psychology is studied as a scientific discipline at Oxford. I'm really interested in research conducted at a particular lab, in this case, the Language and Brain, where does it go? Language and Brain Laboratory. Is it possible for PPL undergrads to access a lab? And I think maybe if we go a little bit broader, do some sort of research internships and time spent on research during their degree. Maybe again, be nice to hear from students. Has anyone done some research placements during their undergraduates?
So this, I think, would be Milena, possibly, as a PPL psychologist.
Yeah.
I can answer that. I took part in 2 different labs. One of them was for my research project. So if you do PPL, you can choose in your 3rd year whether you want to do a psychology research project. I think most PPL people do one because it's just a really great opportunity to do something more practical. So I spent about a year in a lab, like planning an experiment, like recruiting participants, like getting a lot of really good practical experience with what you actually do sort of day to day in a psychology lab. But then outside of that also, not just as part of the curriculum and as part of a research project, I just had a tutor who was teaching social cognitive neuroscience, and I thought what he was doing was really cool. And so he told his class, he was like, if any of you are interested, you can gain some more practical experience with us. But even if your tutor doesn't say that, if you think something like the Brain and Language Lab, like the question said, is really interesting, you can sort of email them from your own initiative and ask. And I think it's always useful to have someone help out with recruiting participants or helping to collect data. So I did that as well for a propagnostia study on face blindness. And that was really interesting too.
Corin probably also did some research placements, right? Well, I know one with us, but also another one, right?
Yeah, so I did 3 placements at my time at Oxford. So myself also did a research project in my final year. And then in the summer of my 2nd and 1st year, I did an internship. So one of them was with Neela, and that was focusing on simultagnosia and a patient after stroke. And then the one in the summer of my 1st year was looking at stuttering and using TDCS as an intervention method for that.
Yeah.
And maybe with regards to things going remote, just I know from the people in the year below me who are now doing the research projects, that's still definitely a big part of the degree. But I guess maybe the meetings with your lab are more likely to be on Teams or something when you're trying to figure out, okay, how do we plan the experiment? And maybe some of your data collection will be more online, but online data collection can also be really great because you just have more access to more participants, and it also uses different skills. So I was just thinking about that as well.
Yeah, so Safi, that must be you at the moment, right? You're planning your research project.
Yeah, so my research project is going to be looking at the effects of maths anxiety on attentional processes. And yeah, we're planning to run an online experiment, but we're still able to do things such as eye tracking because of certain software that's available that like tracks using webcam, like the XY coordinates of eye gaze. So it still gives you a quite good ability. And as Milena said, you can potentially recruit a few more participants that way. And yeah, I've just been having more sort of Zoom meetings with my supervisor and corresponding via email. And hopefully when term starts, we'll be able to do some face-to-face meetings because I do think it is helpful, but there's definitely still, research is still ongoing. And I know some people in the department have had their research projects frozen temporarily, but a lot of them are just trying to make that shift to online testing instead.
Yeah, so I'm very aware that we haven't heard much yet from Jamie Findlay. Do you want to say a little bit, maybe say a little bit about linguistics and what's happening there, and what people might come and study and what they'll see this time around?
You mean sort of pandemic-wise or research project-wise? Yeah. So I mean, so the Language and Brain Lab that was mentioned in the question is is attached to the linguistics department. And they are sort of getting back to some sort of working state now, so that's definitely available. I don't know quite how much overlap there is with psychology there, but I know there are people sort of who make the connection, so I'm sure there are opportunities there. But in general, we're sort of most of our stuff is relatively unaffected in that we are, we sort of made a transition to online teaching, and that's basically what we're sticking with this term, apart from some sort of practical things like in the phonetics lab as well, and the language and brain lab, so places where it's sort of important for people to be present in person. Yeah, so there is an opportunity to do independent research in linguistics as well in your final year or just before, in terms of there's a linguistics project which people often sort of collect their own data for and do some analysis, and it can be all sorts of things. There are people do sort of corpus-based stuff, or they'll do field work. So I mean, I don't know how practical that is these days, but going and recording data from speakers, either of a sort of minority language that they're familiar with, or something else, or they can do experimental stuff as well, or all sorts of other things. So there's plenty of scope for independent research in the linguistics part of the degree as well.
Brilliant. I'm going to go back and answer some of the questions that we've been receiving. So one is asking, so I'll just read out, what will you be asked at an EP interview? Will the focus be mainly on research methods, data analysis, talking about findings of new research, looking at reasons for particular findings, content of your personal statement, or will there be other topics? So probably whoever's asked the question has mentioned most of the things that we would indeed be looking for. We only have typically 20, 25, half an hour time for interviews. So yes, it's mainly about giving you something you've not seen, trying to see if what your interpretation is of particular methods or results or interpretations, and some brief stuff about your personal statement. So that's typically indeed the case. So I'm not sure what other topics might come up. Does anyone from the students, from your experience, was there anything else in interviews rather than that for you?
I think ethics is also one thing that kind of came up, and it might have not been a direct question about ethics, but I think sort of sometimes the tutors are kind of leading you in that direction, whether it's talking about animal research or sort of human studies, but thinking about how you would control for certain things or conduct a study in an ethical way, because that's obviously quite important to research. So I think that might just be one addition that I remember.
Yeah.
I also wanted to say to that, just from the list that person wrote, that doesn't mean to imply that you, for example, need to know findings of certain experiments off the top of your head or certain research methods. I think the interviews were very much set up so that whatever material I would need was there given to me. So either you've read a really short description of an experiment, and they don't presume that you necessarily did psychology at your school, because not all schools have that. So just not to worry anyone who, it's good to look into it on your own time beforehand, but you won't have to know it off the top of your head. It'll all be provided for you at the interview, all the information.
That's a very important point to make. There is no expectation, there's no set levels that you should be doing beforehand. Anyone else want to come in on this, or shall I move to the next question?
I mean, Corinne's point's a good one, isn't it? That it's not just about how you do a piece of research, but what the limits would be on the capacity to do it. And I'm the vice chair of one of the university's research ethics committees, and there are questions about research ethics when, for example, the only way to conduct a study is to deceive the research participant. They think they're doing one thing, but in fact what you're doing is something else. And you'll sometimes find somebody say, well, this is the only way to get the data that we want, therefore we kind of have to deceive people. And the answer just might be, well, in that case, you can't have the data you want because you can't deceive people in the manner you suggest. So it could very well, that is really an extra kind of dimension to thinking about research, what constraints there are on it. And asking people to think through that kind of thing is actually, I think, quite useful.
Yeah, so some more questions have come in. So one is, can you please explain the relation between experimental psychology and psychology, philosophy, and linguistics? So basically, they're just two courses experimental psychology means you just do psychology, and if you do any of the other combinations, you still do the same kind of psychology you would do in experimental psychology, just less of it. And on the other hand, you then fill a fair bit of time with psychology, philosophy, or linguistics, and you can just do philosophy and linguistics on its own. So Jamie, student Jamie, is doing exactly that. So maybe it's worth explaining that relationship then, if you're not doing experimental psychology.
Sure. I mean, it's probably the best way to explain this is by looking at the prelims course, how it works currently. This may change by the time current prospective applicants end up joining. But the current situation is there are 5 papers and everyone takes 3. Everyone takes statistics, and then you take the relevant ones of introduction to psychology, introduction to linguistics, or introduction to philosophy. And then finally, the experimental psychology students only take neuroanatomy, I think is the current name.
Neurophys.
So I, as a philosophy and linguistics student, took introduction to philosophy, introduction to linguistics, and statistics. So you can kind of see how it works, how the overlap works there. And then for the finals course, it kind of like diverts a bit more. But that's essentially how it works. I just don't take any of the psychology papers.
Yeah, just to jump in there, also as a PPL person, but with psychology and philosophy. Yeah, so you don't do neurophysiology in your first year if you're not an EP person. But in my second and third year, I actually had a lot of more like neuroscience stuff because you can choose it, but so you can also go more in that direction if you do PPL. And the Oxford Handbook of PPL actually has a quite nice sentence in like trying to link them up, and it says that the degree is supposed to offer like a scientific and philosophical understanding of the mind, brain, behavior, experience, language, and the complex interactions between them. So I think like if you're curious about people's internal worlds and like how they relate to the world around them and use language to do that, I think it's like the perfect degree for that, if that helps kind of describe what they're trying to get at.
One thing we should add, I think, is that you're doing less psychology, but the way that works is that you do the same depth in what you do, you just do less things. So you'll be making selections from the experimental psychology menu. You won't be doing all the same things to half the depth. So you will be making choices that probably will connect quite naturally with the other subject you're studying if you're doing PPL. So if you're doing philosophy and psychology, you might very well be interested in some sort of cognitive sciencey questions of various sorts that might lead you down particular paths within psychology, and to do particular papers in philosophy too. If you're doing philosophy and linguistics, then there's a philosophy of logic and language paper on the philosophy side and various ways of making connections between the two subjects. If you're interested in language development, then frankly, any of the two taken together can provide you with overlap interests in that. And you'd come out at the end with a PPL degree where you'd had probably, I mean, you'd certainly have a grounding in 2 academic areas rather than just in psychology. But you'd also probably have quite a focus on something, language development, the one I've just mentioned, so let's say that, that will give you particular expertise in that could carry over into a clinical setting or into a research axis. You will be qualified as long as you do enough psychology in psychology and philosophy or psychology and linguistics. You'll have enough psychology to do clinical practice later, to train as a clinical psychologist if that's what you want to do.
Thanks. So next question, how did the students choose which college they went to? So how did you guys choose? Shall we start with Safi? We haven't heard much from you yet. Safi, how did you choose?
So yeah, I did go to some open days, which I realized will be difficult for people to go and see the colleges in person, but I would definitely also recommend trying to visit virtually as many colleges as you can, and speaking to the students to also get a feel for you know, that what they think of their college, because obviously their personal insight will be helpful. And obviously you want to choose colleges that offer the subjects you're hoping to apply for, because not all colleges offer all subjects, and so that's something obviously worth mentioning, which can be easily overlooked. And it's tricky because I think they all do look quite similar on paper. but there's certain things you can consider. And the SU, so if you type in Oxford Students' Union, they have a really good website where you can select, you can put in certain preferences. So things like, do you want a smaller or larger college? Would you like to be a bit more central? Or, I mean, most colleges are pretty central anyway, and all within a 10, 15-minute walk of each other. But if you would want to be really central, a little bit further out, lots of things like the different facilities you might want, accommodation, these are all really important things to consider. And you can tick preferences on that website, which I'll try and get the link for and put on Slido. Yeah, and you can, and then they will give you a list of colleges that they think might be good for you. And there are also, I think colleges have their own sort of slight different reputations, which you might want to take with a pinch of salt, but there are certain things. So I chose Wadham College partly because it's known for being particularly progressive and welcoming, for which all colleges will say that they are, of course. But yeah, and they have some cool events that they have throughout the year, which I thought were really, really good. But yeah, so there's lots of different things you can consider.
Anyone want to come in and say something about how they chose?
I would probably add that the most important thing for choosing a college isn't how the degree will be taught. We kind of discussed this at the last open day, because people think that it's more reflective of what your degree will be like, but actually it's more about your student experience by far. So like Safi was saying, it's about the type of college you want. Someone more traditional, for instance, that you will wear your gown to when you go to hall, although all those things might be a bit different. But so kind of considering those factors is more important. The only thing I would say is that I looked at the tutors at the college as well. I wouldn't say that's the be on end all that you will be taught at many colleges, especially for EP. I had tutorials at loads of colleges, but they will be most likely be your personal tutor. So maybe if you already have a sort of interest area, choosing a college that has a tutor that focuses on that area could help with maybe getting internship placements, or just kind of having someone that shares that interest can be really exciting. So that's just one.
Yeah, I was also going to highlight though that so for your first year, you'll be taught within college for your prelims exams, which don't count, but once you start your finals, which sort of do count towards your final grade, most of your or all of your psychology teaching will be across different colleges. And from my understanding, the psychology department does that on purpose, because they sort of want to equalize having access to all the different tutors at all the different colleges, because some specialize more into one direction or in another. So basically you'll get a great education no matter where you go. And I was also just going to highlight again that I went to a mature student college with regards to how I chose my college, which means you have to be over 21 by the time you start. So if you're 20, you can apply. So we get a lot of people who are from different countries where you have to do military service, so you're a bit older when you apply, or took gap years, or maybe did a different degree and then switched over. So if you have maybe a less, I don't want to call it less traditional, but if you're not coming right out of school, but you're still interested in applying for Oxford, that would be the place. It's the only mature student college in Oxford. And also part of why I chose it was that it was small. It's the absolute smallest college of all of them. And that might be for anyone who wants to apply. Look at the size of the college. Like maybe you want a really big group of people where you are a bit more anonymous but have a close group of friends, or maybe you want a small college where everyone sort of knows each other. That might be something worth looking at. And I put the link of what Safi was talking about in the Slido to the SU, where you can fill in your preferences, and then it does the permutation and spits out the colleges that might fit.
Can we do one more, Jamie? How did you pick?
Yeah, before I discuss how I pick, it's worth also saying linguistics is taught centrally, the exception being the core paper, paper A, which you're taught by your college tutor, which for me was Jamie for one of my years, the other Jamie. And so, yeah, it doesn't really matter which college you pick anyway. And I'm going to have had 3 linguistics organizing tutors over my 3 years. So I wouldn't pick it based on who you think the tutor's going to be, because it probably won't be that tutor anyway.
Yeah, I kind of chose partly because I thought there would be a certain tutor at Wadham, and then he had switched to uni. So by the time I got there.
Yeah, so the important thing to say definitely is that when you choose a college, you're expressing a preference. So because we interview in 2 colleges and we do a fair bit of open offers, it may be that you end up not necessarily in the one you apply to. So please keep an open mind about where you'll actually end up, and Now, I say this every time, but I'll say it once more. In-group feelings are very strong, so in social psychology. So as soon as you're as part of that college, within weeks, or within days, you'll think, oh, I'm so glad I ended up here. This is so much better than whatever else I applied for. So people really feel strongly about their colleges, and people who go there, whether they chose that or not, all have that same feeling.
Yeah, I would look at things like what resources the college has, because college's ability to give like funding or have 24-hour library all comes down to like individual colleges and the funding they have. So if you're like, for me, I really wanted a 24-hour library because I work at weird times. So Jesus has that, but not all colleges do. But also look at locations. So Jesus has a great location, like right in the center of Oxford, which I really enjoyed. But then you also look at things like where you're actually going to be living. So I knew I didn't really want to have to deal with like trying to like independently find accommodation, because that just wasn't something I was interested in doing, because it's a little bit more expensive. And so I chose a college which would guarantee accommodation for 3 years. However, Jesus also has like annex sites, so I wasn't always on the central site, and that's something which is worth noting, that although we have fantastic location 2 of the years, you don't live out. So it's worth looking at like where you're going to be living, because you might have to live really far away. And to be honest, like when it comes down to the actual day-to-day experience of being at a college, the thing you're probably going to care about most is what time you have to roll out of bed to get to your lecture on time. So honestly, things like location, which seem kind of irrelevant when you're applying, are probably the most important thing.
And also how it's catered, like if you eat all your meals in colleges and that's included in the rent, because we actually had some people who, if you live in our college, you have to eat in the college, but if you have certain, they try to cater for certain disabilities or preferences, but sometimes it's just not possible. So that's like worth looking into. Sorry, Dave, I interrupted you.
No, I was just going to note Jamie's words, really far away, and say that if you live really far away from Oxford, you might think really far away sounds really serious. Really far away in Oxford is around about 4 minutes and 30 seconds to anywhere. That's really far away. If you can't get there in slippers, then there's a problem. That's kind of really far away. Your world shrinks when you're in Oxford. We sometimes talk about colleges being sort of the frozen north or Siberia or something. And I don't think either Neela or Corin, who are at St Anne's, which is north of the city centre, but really not very far north, would think of where they are as Siberia. So here, really far away in an Oxford context, when you're a student, your world really shrinks.
Yeah. Well, yeah, especially, St Anne's is pretty much next to Jericho, which is really great now that the department's here.
Yes.
So there's far and far is 2 different things with lots of different people in the...
You're getting a lot of propaganda for various colleges here. I'm going to stay neutral on this one.
No, so please go and look at all the colleges. There's loads. I mean, we just happen to represent 4 here, 5. Well, anyway, this is not what we're here for. Please go and look at them and go and talk to tutors there and find out this. But really, it's a preference. It's not a complete commitment that you will end up in this college. That's probably the last line to just reconfirm on that. There's a question here about job prospects of a degree like psychology and philosophy. And I think I might give this again to Dave, because he must get this a lot. You know, what kind of jobs do you do if you do philosophy? And I'm sure you've answered this many times, but maybe.
Yeah. So one thing to say, which is important to say about any university degree, is there are a range of careers that come out of having a good university degree from a good university, and there's just a package of these things, and it pretty much doesn't matter what you've studied. So if you want to go into law, then you could do history or English or philosophy and psychology or linguistics, and you'll still be qualified with a good degree to carry on down that kind of pathway. So what do people do? I mean, just thinking back, we have had people go into law, we've had people go into primary school teaching. had one person who went into law and hated it and went into primary school teaching. I think the most exotic, probably, which our predecessor as a philosophy tutor in my college always used to sort of talk about, because it was so exotic, was a sort of national park warden in South Africa. That was pretty good. That was not the sort of thing you'd automatically think a psychology degree would qualify somebody for. But the whole range of available careers, which of course, as we've said, includes research science. So just going into researching in psychology or in philosophy or in linguistics. But then there's clinical careers that could arise out of studying psychology, and those will be the full range of psychological careers, just as much as if you've done experimental psychology. So there's things the degree prepares you for quite specifically, those sort of clinical careers. There's advertising, there's fashion and retail, there's all of the things that might be of interest to you. Pretty much you're going to be qualified for if you do this degree, and some of them are quite specific to it, but most of them frankly aren't.
I mean, just to quickly say, I did psychology, philosophy, and linguistics with psychology, philosophy as my focus, kind of for that purposes that I knew I could kind of go into a bunch of different directions. And I'm now going to be doing an internship or like working in communications for a solar power company, which I didn't expect to be doing, but I'm really excited for. So if you are just really interested in the degree, that was sort of the thing I chose, is that I was like, for 3 years, I want to be reading this. So it doesn't need to be vocational, but it's worth pointing out that I think in some European countries, and I'm from Germany, sometimes it does actually very much matter what you've studied. So if I wanted to apply for a job and like help, like an internship in an art gallery or something, they would actually want to see some sort of modules in like art history or something. Otherwise they like actually don't really care that you went to Oxford. So if you, depending on whether you want to go back to somewhere in Europe where you might be living, you probably know this as a fact already, but it is also actually worth looking at how much flexibility there is afterwards. Because I know in the UK there is, but not actually everywhere. So just wanted to point that out.
It's a very
linguistics. Sorry, can I just say a bit about linguistics? Yeah, so I mean, also there's a lot of opportunity now, particularly in sort of natural language processing areas and like automatic speech recognition, and there's all sorts of sort of scope for people with linguistics backgrounds, because I think there seems to be a sort of cycle in these things where they want a bunch of computer scientists who've done stats, then they do that for a while, then they realize that actually they don't know anything about language, so then they want a bunch of linguists to help sort of correct some of these things, and then they go back. But at the moment, we're quite into linguists, so so there's a sort of good potential in that domain as well. Also, the career service is really good. Oxford does have a really good career service that does a lot of support and help with like interview practice, CV writing, kind of what to look for in job ads and stuff. So that's a really good resource, whatever you're looking to get into.
And just as a dog is for life and not just for Christmas, a careers service is for life and not just for when you graduate. And that's a really important thing that we can advertise to everybody, that you graduate from Oxford and the career service is there for you to help you with the first job, but it's also there to go back to later if you want support and help, if you're thinking of retraining or you're interested in maybe making a career change. The career service advertises itself as there for life for its graduates, and that's something I don't suppose every university can offer, but that's really a very important thing.
Yeah, people go into, so maybe the only one that we haven't talked about much yet, which is quite a big cohort as well, go into finance and auditing, because there's quite a big chunk of stats that you'll have in any of the combinations in EP or PPL. And so that kind of route into more finance services is one that's also often taken by quite a lot of our graduates, again, irrespective of combinations or not. So there's been quite a few questions coming in, so I'll go through a few more. So what's the difference between EP and the neuroscience pathway through biomedical science? And I'll try and just give that a very brief answer. In that within experimental psychology, we do a lot of neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience and cognitive neuroscience, and that pathway is very clearly there. And the focus here is always on behavior. So I think that's probably the easiest way in trying to distinguish them. If you do the neuroscience pathway through biomedical sciences, you end up in neuroscience as well, but the focus often is on the cellular mechanisms first, and then you get to behavior, whereas in the EP, the behavior is the core focus, and then you go into the neuroscience of this kind of behavior and cognition and thinking. So the main difference is in terms of courses you take. So biochemistry and all of those things are not part of the EP course, but they would be part of the biomedical sciences course, because there's you start molecule first, whereas in psychology and we start behavior first. So that's probably the simplest explanation. There's quite a few, so I'll just move on to another one. How many students are accepted for linguistics and philosophy? Is there a cap on these numbers? So is there a cap on the numbers? There's no specific cap for linguistics and philosophy. So I'm assuming they mean that specific combination.
I would have thought that's probably what they mean. So Jamie, not students, so Jamie Finley, is there a cap? Because linguistics is really a laboratory subject. So do you have a number cap on the department? It wouldn't just be for PPL, but...
No, I mean, there's not that much. There's certainly no sort of obligatory laboratory work, apart maybe in your first year doing a bit of phonetics and phonology. But no, we have sort of preferred numbers, and then colleges ride roughshod over them. So there's no fixed cap there.
I mean, it's probably worth saying that some colleges do specifically look for people doing philosophy and linguistics, might have a couple of places set aside for that. So 2 or 3 colleges, I think, might be in that position. So it would be very unusual in a given year if we didn't have, maybe at least 8 people doing philosophy and linguistics, and it could be higher than that. But colleges can just choose who they want, and it's worth saying to everybody about all of these combinations that most colleges will have PPL and experimental psychology applicants, and they'll look at them and they'll work out which are the best ones. And in the college I teach for, if we had 3 places and the best 3 were all experimental psychologists, then 3 experimental psychologists will get the places. And if there were 3 people doing philosophy and linguistics, then our psychology tutor would be very sad. But that's, just they were the best 3. That's quite unlikely to happen. And usually there's a degree of moving people around between colleges, but colleges are open to getting the best candidates places. And although the statistics tends to kind of settle down, so there's normally about, so I'm going to look at Neela here and ask, but it's about 60% EP and 40% PPL roughly over a year.
Roughly. So this is probably the thing to say, there's no cap we've established on philosophy and linguistics, but there's also no cap on EP, and there's no cap on psychology and linguistics, and there's no cap on psychology and philosophy. So they don't have separate quotas for these separate combinations. We treat it all as a gathered field. And it usually, kind of pans out roughly 60, or maybe 65-35 or 60-40. But yeah, that's not set.
I think that's quite an important point, because so this is entirely impressionistic, but I have been worried in the past occasionally that people have tried to apply strategically for things because they've thought, oh, well, people won't apply for philosophy and for psychology and linguistics, for example, so I'll apply for that, even though I really want to get in for psychology. And then they do brilliantly on the psychology side, terribly on the linguistic side, and then we have a fight because psychology likes them and we don't, and then they don't get a place. Whereas if they just applied for EP, they might have done, for example. So because I think people might think that they can kind of play the numbers or whatever, but like you say, it really is just one big pool. So you should really just focus on what you actually want to do.
What you really want.
Yeah.
That's definitely the take-home message.
For sure.
So this is probably a very relevant pandemic question as well. So as you've accepted more students for the incoming class of 2020, will the places for the next cycle be affected? So the answer here is that yes, we did take more places. So you probably saw all over the news, we accepted higher numbers than we would have done because there was no actual real grades for us to look at, right? So most people were taken, and we have got a bigger cohort coming in. But importantly, for EP and PPL, this means that they're all coming this year. So some courses and some places have had to make deferred offers just because they haven't had enough space. So some are going in next year, but for EP and PPL, we just decided to take the hits this year. So they're all coming this year. So in that sense, the number of places for next cycle should be as they were, and we hope to go back to normal next year. So there's no places being reserved for deferred candidates. That's not the case for us. So it's probably an important one to stress. I'm not sure what else there is to say about that, so I'm going to move on to the next question. Main differences between PPL and human sciences. Milena, go for it.
I have a thought on this because I was actually looking at human sciences before applying to PPL, and they were sort of my top two choices before I ended up narrowing down to PPL. And I think it was, because it makes sense, because if you're drawn to one, you might be drawn to the other. I think from having friends who did human sciences now throughout my bachelor's, it all sounded really exciting. But I think the main difference I noticed is that, because you're dealing with similar questions, but I felt like for PPL, what you get mainly is, if you're looking at the psychology of something, you're looking at the individual. So your unit of analysis is sort of like one person. Sometimes you have social psychology where you're like, okay, how do these individual agents relate to each other? Whereas for human sciences, it's a different level of analysis because you're looking at groups en masse a lot. So you're like with demography and sociology and things like that, you're not really narrowing in on that individual level of like what is internally going on in this person's mind or behavior, their neuroscience. You're more, when you're doing the things that might relate to psychology, I feel like you're looking more at how groups and social structures interact, or you're looking really at the cellular DNA. So if that gives any feedback on someone who's trying to decide if you're more interested in, this looking at individuals maybe, then maybe more in the direction of PPL. But if you're really more interested in these like social structures, then more human sciences. That would be my 5 cents.
I'd say it's also always worth looking, if you haven't already, at the course structure page on each page of the university's website, and really like looking at it in detail to compare what's being covered across all different years as well, because there may be slightly more overlap, say in first year when things are more introductory, and then just as your option to specialize as you get throughout the course, it might change a lot more dramatically for human science and EP. So it's always worth, or PPL, it's always worth looking at that in detail.
Great. So, hi, I have a BA in another discipline, 15 years project management experience. I want to study Sci and Phil. How do I apply? Well, you apply. So I'm not sure what to say. So you would have to fill in the UCAS form, just like anyone else. So you apply the regular way. Milena, do you want to come in?
Yeah, sure, because I think this is a mature student-specific question. I'll try and keep it brief, but because the end of the question was what matters, school grades or experience. I think what's great about the Oxford admissions process is that they really do probably get a holistic picture of you. I remember when I was applying as a mature student, at the time, one of the regulations was that they'd prefer you to have been in education in the last 6 years at some point. That's not a necessary factor though. So I think if, I also know people who got in who hadn't been in school for 15 years. I think in that case, they're really going to be interested in your TSA, your essay writing in the TSA, and your interview, because those are the two academic ways they can look at you academically. If you haven't been doing anything academic for the last 15 years, they'll be curious about that. But work experience is also really great, so don't feel disadvantaged. And you also have the opportunity to write a second essay if you're a mature student. You can keep your personal statement about the subjects you're applying for, but then you can submit a second essay to the mature student college where you give contextual experience from your work because you're a mature student and you might have more to write about, if that helps.
All right, brilliant. So this is a question about contextualization. So I'm concerned about how my application will be contextualized since I do not go to school in the UK. Could you offer any insights into this? Contextualization outside the UK data is hard for us, for sure, but this is where your statement from your school comes in. So the, what's it called? Dave, what's it called? It's not the school statement. It's
the school reference.
The school reference. Yeah, so this is where that can come in and explain where you rank in your cohort, where you sit within the school's resources. So these things do get read. So this kind of more detailed contextualization, which is not automatically done. For example, with GCSEs, we have automatic contextualization depending on school performance. If you're an international student, and obviously that's missing, but please make sure it's present in the school statement.
Yeah, and I would say alongside that, like if you have anything you particularly want to make sure is contextualized or is transferred and conveyed, I mean, it might be worth asking a teacher who is involved in the reference writing process to make sure that those particular things are highlighted, especially if they might not even be aware, or they might not realize that it's relevant to the Oxford application. So I think there is scope, to communicate with your school and make sure that they're highlighting particular things. Yeah.
Great. There's a very quick question. Is the assignment to the second college for interview random? Yes. Yes, it is. That's the short answer. So
it's not so random that you end up with a college that doesn't accept the combination you want. So if you're going for philosophy and linguistics, it's random within the colleges that accept for philosophy and linguistics. I think we should add that. Yeah. So, yeah.
But yeah, there's no, it's just, there's literally a button, choose second college, and it randomly assigns.
I mean, it's not totally random in the sense it's more likely to be those that still have slots, right? So it's of those that don't already have an overly large number of applicants applying. I don't want to...
well, I mean, maybe then we should say a little bit more about that, because colleges that are very popular,
like
so,
you want to say.
well, like... I don't like to say, but so a college might have, say, 60 applicants, and it might very well be that when we look at the overall scores of all of the applicants, of those 60, we decide that maybe 30 shouldn't be called for interview when you compare their performance with everybody else's. So we've now got 30, and the college no college is going to be interviewing all of 30. But we don't then just lose the number that we would lose in order to get it down to the number we can interview, so that all the people we interview are the ones who've applied to us. We actually select from the top of that. Well, I mean, the college can select any, let's say, 10 that they like, or 8 that they like to select. And then the rest are available potentially for the admissions coordinator, which is Neela for our degrees, to allocate to other colleges, because those will be strong candidates who ought to get 2 interviews at colleges that are looking. So there's a certain amount of moving good candidates around between colleges before we even call you for interview. So some people won't be called for interview, a lot won't, I'm afraid, be called for interview because we have so many applicants. But those who are called for interview might be called for interview even at a college other than the one they applied for. And that's not because the first college didn't think you were worth coming for interview. They'll be the ones who actually decided that you should be interviewed, but they then won't have enough places to really interview everybody. So we do a certain amount of moving around. Some of it's to top up colleges that don't have enough candidates yet. But some of it's also to try and equalise the strength of the field of colleges and allow them then all the candidates to have the best chance of getting in. We're trying to make sure that whatever college you applied for, you have as good a chance of getting in as your ability should give you. And that is really the underlying business in all the work that Neela and I and others do in trying to coordinate this process.
This is the process of reallocation that we're referring to here. So this is before you get assigned a second college, you have to get assigned a first college. And that may be the one you applied to, or that may be a different one. So if there is cases of oversubscription to particular colleges, we will reallocate so that they can still see second college interviews as well. So they don't just see their first college interviews. And that, people are spread out. So what we're really trying to do is make sure that no matter where you apply, this should not affect your chances of getting in. That's how we try and distribute everyone. So once we've assigned everyone first colleges, then we randomly allocate second colleges. So that's the random button. it's true though that there is a bit of stuff going on beforehand. Yeah, but honestly, it's not done in any way to disadvantage anyone. If anything, what we're trying to do
The
is
reverse. Yeah.
and that's how it goes. So yeah, maybe it did warrant a bit of a longer answer. So then, are you able to switch from EP to other psychological majors? I'm not quite sure I understand. If I understand it correctly, it may be the question to switch from EP to PPL.
Yeah.
So yes, really is the short answer. Longer answers involve that that's not an automatic and that's not a given, and you may need additional interviewing for that. You need to do well on your prelims. So it's not that it's impossible, but it's also not just oh, I'll apply to one thing and then halfway through switch to another. So it's yes, possible, yes, systems are in place, but it's, yeah, there's some conditions to go with it.
And it's worth saying, perhaps just to give an idea of why this is not a trivial thing, not all colleges admit for or teach for linguistics, say. So if you wanted to apply for experimental psychology and you get a place, and then you want to do psychology and linguistics, that will be much easier at some colleges than it will at others. Some colleges will just shrug their shoulders and say, well, that's fine, and let you swap. Others will even get to the point, particularly if you're very interested in linguistics, want to do a significant amount of it, of thinking whether you would need to transfer colleges. And that it's a fairly rare thing for people to swap degrees once they get here anyway, because they've usually done a lot of good groundwork before they get here to work out what they want to apply for. It's best to get that right first time, not just for the reasons Jamie mentioned earlier on of trying to game the system by applying for something that's not very popular and then try and move sideways into something else. If your interests change and if you're very clever, then the college will try and help you to move to what you want to do. That's certainly right. But it's never a trivial thing, and it's something that might well prove to be too difficult. The move from, in particular, a psychology PPL combination to experimental psychology, that's often really quite straightforward, because your college obviously already admits for psychology, and that's probably the easiest swap, one of the easiest swaps in the university, I would say. But the going the other way, and particularly to something a college wouldn't routinely be teaching, that's much harder.
Yeah.
Is it worth, Neela, on the, there's a question about tripartite PPL that I don't think we've picked up yet, and we probably ought to say something about that before it disappears off the top. So this is a question about PPL and application. So you always apply for just 2 PPL subjects. You don't apply for all 3. And they have different course codes, and you select one of them, that's what you apply for. And the question that's been asked is, if you then wanted to do all 3, or maybe you apply thinking you would like to do all 3, what's the procedure there and how difficult is it and what would be required? If you have interests that intersect in the 3 areas, and that's likely to be probably around the areas of the area of language most significantly, then it's perfectly reasonable of you to make it clear at interview or at some point in the admissions process that that is your interest, and therefore you have interests that are psychological, linguistic, and philosophical. Fundamentally, you would need, after prelims, to have proved yourself to be very industrious, because it's a pretty tough ask to do all 3, and very clever. And it's not something that would happen routinely. Being tripartite, as we call it, doing all 3 subjects in PPL, is something tutors, if they resist, won't be resisting because they are kind of desperately concerned that they want to keep people from this degree. Their fundamental concern is going to be that you're going to do well on it, and do yourself justice on it. So it's a very rare thing for somebody to be tripartite in PPL, but it is a possible thing. We wrote it into the scheme as something that people would be able to do. And it's not a negotiation to happen really at any degree of depth before you get to Oxford. It's something that has to happen once you're here, once you're proving yourself in 2 of the disciplines. Then at that point, the conversation happens with your college about whether, if you've missed, as you will probably have missed, the introductory subject for one of the 3 areas, perhaps the introductory philosophy. So you've done psychology and linguistics, you now want to do some philosophy. Well, let's have a conversation about how we might make that happen. It's worth saying though too, so Neela, you can say more about this because you'll know the EP scheme better, that you can do EP and do philosophy paper or a philosophy paper or philosophy papers in finals in EP as well.
Yeah, that's what I was going to add. So there is soft options of doing a tripartite, right? So you can do 2 and yet choose to do one of your finals options in the 3rd subject. So you would still be graduating specifically, say, in psychology and philosophy, but you can take a linguistics paper in your final year. Similarly, you can do EP and take a philosophy paper in your final year. So there is ways for you to get a bit of everything if that's what you want, without necessarily taking on the load of basically 3 halves, right? So you'd be doing 1.5 course rather than everybody else is doing 1 course. So there is a way of bringing it in without making it a tripartite. And I think that's what most people end up doing who've got an interest beyond. I see Jamie Findlay also nodding. So is that also your experience?
Well, Milena has come off mute, so maybe she's got a contribution here.
No, I'm also interested to hear what Jamie Findlay has to say. I just wanted to also say that when I was applying, a huge motivation was the fact that I could do tripartite. I was really excited about it. I think it sounds great from the outset, but I think once you're here, it's worth remembering that in finals, you end up really only doing 8 like papers basically, which even if you're doing 2, I had 4 in philosophy, 2 of which were like core that I had to do. 1 was my thesis. So I only could choose 1 subject, and I was torn between like feminism and post-Kantian. So I already felt really restricted. Not really restricted, it was a great course, but if you're doing 2, you end up being quite restricted. And I think it would have seemed impossible, like doing 3, you just end up getting something more broad. And I also looked at what I could have done in the 3rd if I'd done tripartite, and would have also only been sort of their introductory stuff. So it's worth thinking about doing 2 and doing them more deeply rather than doing 3, and then you're gonna get just not as deep into those 3. That's sort of, I guess, the reason why, as Dave pointed out, the tripartite was set up as this sort of thing. So there's big motivations for only doing 2 as well, but I don't want to discourage anyone either.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything profound. I was just nodding in agreement, really. That was, yeah, and I agree entirely with what Milena said as well. I think it's really hard to fit everything in, basically, if you want to do all 3. So yeah, a lot of people think it's a good idea, and then they start thinking about the practicalities, think, actually, I think it's safer to stick with what I'm doing, and then maybe take 1 paper or something if they're interested.
Yeah, I would just add, sorry, Jamie, it's a little bit different, but for the students that were asking about biomed and neuroscience versus EP, there is an option in your final year to take the neuroscience section of the medical sciences paper, which is shared with the medics and the biomedics. So that's something that I really considered. I ended up not taking because, as Milena was saying, it's quite, you have a narrow number of options, and I really liked the more biological psychology option, so I went with that. But to know that if you're slightly different, but you're an EP student that really likes the biological neuroscience side, there is also that option in your 3rd year to do that instead of taking the full biomed pathway, which doesn't give you a BPS accredited degree, for instance.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, so there is a lot of choice. That remains the case. So one of the other questions, and maybe I'll do this before the TSA one, is do you study psychology more than the other subjects you've chosen if you do PPL? And so the short answer is that's up to you. So you can choose the weighting. So if you want to get what Corin was just talking about, a BPS accredited degree, meaning that you can go on and do clinical degrees in psychology if you wish, then you do need to take half. So you do need to, take enough psychology for us to be able to qualify under that scheme. But if you're not interested in that and you say you do psychology and linguistics and you actually want to do more linguistics, then that is possible. You just take less psychology and more linguistics. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a 50-50 swap, although most tend to go for that. Definitely, we've got some students who, for example, are doing more linguistics and less psychology, and then we have some that are doing more psychology and are minimizing linguistics. So there is versions of combinations that allow you to do 50-50 or slightly more of one and slightly more of the other. So it's not necessarily that you do more of it. If you do 50-50, it's exactly the same kind of weighting to say. So, did you do 50-50 split, Milena, on psychology and philosophy?
Yeah, I did an exact 50-50 split, and I think the motivation for that in part is to get a BPS accredited psychology undergrad, so you can go on to do a master's in psychology if you're doing PPL. You have to 50% basically of your degree has to be psychology. So if you're doing two, you'll end up with 50-50. If that makes sense, if you're not doing tripartite. So yeah, I did 50-50.
Jamie, what are you doing? You doing 50-50 philosophy and linguistics, or more of one?
So I'm taking 5 philosophy papers and 3 linguistics papers, and that kind of links into what the previous question. What I was going to say is, when I applied, I was like, oh, I would definitely take up the tripartite, because I thought it meant that you just basically did extra papers, but you don't. So I ended up not taking psychology papers because it would have meant taking less philosophy papers. So I wanted to max out on the philosophy papers, which is why I do 5 philosophy and 3 linguistics. And one of those philosophy papers is the thesis.
Excellent. So I think that handles that question quite well. So then I have one other one about what's the best way to prepare for the TSA tests and the interviews. So we've done quite a bit of pre-recorded material on this, which is probably worth looking at, but we can briefly talk about it here as well. TSA prep is typically you just practice. You just go and find the old questions and run through them. Is that how all the students did it? Yeah.
Yeah, practice. There are a few books out there if you want to get them. I'm not sure they're fantastic, but they might help a little bit. And in my opinion, go through the past papers that you've done carefully and try and figure out where you went wrong.
Yeah, one of the books, the one that I got that was quite useful, was the one that just has all the practice questions in. So instead of trying to find a book that's like how to ace the TSA and trying to give you a formula to do it, it's practice is better. But obviously just having all the questions together can be quite useful, and then you can just sort of work your way through a bulk load.
Yeah, and I'd say the most important thing as well, one of the most important things is practicing that timed conditions, because it is very, very tricky. I mean, I ran out of time in my one. I worked out fine in the end, but obviously it wasn't the best feeling. So yeah, I would definitely make sure, and then that was even with having practice in time conditions. It is very, very tricky to especially if you don't solve problems like super quickly, because with the calculations that are involved. But yeah, practice definitely makes perfect, and you get used to the kinds of calculations that would be required. So yeah.
Interesting comment from Vinka just coming in that there will be practice on the online digital system that will be happening this time around. So details to be released apparently. So for those of you who are sitting digital versions of TSA this time around, there'll be a version to practice to actually see what it will look like and how the budget will work. So that's
it's go Safi. Yeah.
I was just going to say, for interview preparation, I would recommend, if you can, obviously just practice talking about your subject, talking about reading that you've done in your personal statement, perhaps. And if wherever possible, try and you can do that with friends and family. You can also ask a teacher at school. Maybe if a teacher, teaches a sort of relevant subject, like if you have a psychology teacher, but that's absolutely not, necessary. It's more just about having that practice of talking it through, and they might be able to give you feedback as well in terms of, how you came across, how you discussed your thoughts out loud across time. So that's really helpful. And obviously, because of the format going online, maybe trying to set up practice on a virtual interview, that could be really helpful too.
Yeah, it might be worth talking about this in a little bit more depth, because we've never actually talked about how to prepare for an interview. I just went and checked. Practice is a really good thing. I think definitely, even if it's just with parents or siblings or friends, getting used to like talking aloud and not just thinking in your head is really useful, because the tutors are trying to really see what's going on in your head, what you're thinking about, especially in subjects like philosophy, psychology, and linguistics. There's no single answer, so they don't want to just see you say a single answer. They want to see your thought processes and how you're trying to learn and understand what's going on. So I think that ability to think aloud is something that doesn't come like naturally. So a couple practices is really good for getting that going.
Yeah.
Then in practical logistical terms, rereading the books that you've put on your personal statements or going through some notes that you made on them. You don't need to know them inside out, but tutors often like to use them as like a launching pad because they know, well, theoretically you've read them, so that should be something you're comfortable with. So that's a good starting place.
I was also thinking that I think one thing that quite helped me is, or which I would recommend, is getting comfortable with the feeling of dealing with material that is probably a bit out of your depth, if that makes sense, because that's probably what's going to be presented to you in the interviews. They're not presuming you've ever seen this, and they don't expect you to know the answer. They just want to see, okay, like, what's your initial response to this and where do you go from there? So if there's any way you can just, in advance, either just psychologically or through a bit of practice, like get comfortable with the feeling of, okay, I don't know this and I probably can't find the perfect answer, but I can somehow approach it in some way. I can think of something, like what comes to mind. I think that would probably really help. And then the second good bit of interview advice I think I got in advance from just practicing with a family member was, you can take your time in answering. Like if you're presented with something, you can definitely just say, give me a second to think about that, and just pause for 20 seconds and collect your thoughts and then see what you've come up with. So yeah, I thought that was quite helpful.
Can I just sort of add a few things? So you probably live with your parents and your siblings. So if you fall out over anything you're talking about, that might be difficult. I always think grandparents are a very useful resource here. They probably think well of you, but they think very well of you, but you probably don't live with them. So they could be useful. If they are Zoom friendly grandparents, they could even do it online, and that would kill two birds with one stone. So that would be kind of good. That's one thing. Another thing, though, is that whoever you are talking with needs to get the thought that what we're after is thought. We're not after eloquence. We're not after keeping as straight and unfurrowed a brow as you can. We are after thought. And the best interviews are often quite halting. They often require us to go back over some ground. And if the person who's talking with you is after fluency, because that's what they think a good interview looks like, they're probably going to be misleading you. Don't be misled by that. Find somebody who's interested, not in hearing you talk, like deliver a speech, but in hearing you and then understanding and asking questions. And they can be as dumb a question as you know, that's useful, because if you've got to explain things and you never, ever understand what you don't understand until you try and teach it. So just something you've been doing at A-level in any subject or on the IB or anything, try and explain that to somebody who doesn't know anything about it and see how you get on. All of that is really good practice for interview, but definitely not, can you deliver a monologue without breathing for 2 minutes? That's kind of, I mean, if you can do it, that will be impressive, but it'll be impressive for the university swimming team. It won't be impressive for academic stuff.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Like, to add to that, your parents are most likely to be thinking about job interviews, because that's what they'll probably be prepared for. My dad, when I initially practiced with him, was like essentially giving me, like, you know, shake their hand firmly and classic job interview tips. Now, those are great for job interviews, not so great for Oxford interviews. So we very quickly stopped. Similarly, my mum cannot stand philosophy, so that ended very quickly. We stopped me trying to explain philosophical ideas to her. So the grandparents' idea is really good, but definitely practice with people who actually understand what it's meant to be about. I've had people give me advice being like, you need to be more eloquent, or you need to give firm handshakes, or just stuff like that. So maybe mates or teachers who are familiar with the Oxbridge application process, maybe even if you know any students at the university, those are kind of potentially better people to practice.
And
Yeah,
I think the SAQs on the TSA are really useful preparation, like the questions they ask in the essay section of the TSA. If you try and do those as interview questions, that probably works quite well. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't said about the TSA essay that it's important to practice that as well. You can focus on the multiple choice bit. You need to be quick on the multiple choice bit. We have said that, but you also need to be pretty quick on the essay, because you're planning and preparing and thinking about the question before you ever start writing, you need to give that planning and thinking enough time. If you don't, then your essay is just going to be a splurge of words. And we absolutely want it to be a thoughtful response to the actual question that we've asked. Important too to say the questions we've asked are the ones that we would like you to answer. So even if your A-levels say, expect that you will see a key word, and then even though the question doesn't require it, you'll give a certain block of material back in response. Our questions are exactly what we want to ask, and we would like you to answer those. Now, you need to remember that this is a test also taken by our politics applicants, and we want to change the world here. We want to get politicians to answer the question. So it's important that everybody tries to answer the question we've asked.
Yeah, I would say the exact same thing for interviews. I think something that maybe I did a bit wrong is that I read really widely, and I love the content that I read. So I really wanted to get that in. I remember one interview, they started talking about my personal statement. I was like, yes, I want to talk all about this. I'm not going to stop until I'm finished. And actually that was great because I was really passionate about that. So it showed that side, but make sure you're answering the question. I would say probably the best interview tip that I found, even going into like work interviews now, is that just before the interview, maybe get yourself a completely clear mind so that when you're going into the actual room, you're just answering the question that they give, and you're not presenting material that you've already read that you know will show yourself off, because that's not what they're looking for. So it's that fine balance between definitely do like your reading, have your great personal statement, and bring it in if it's relevant, but don't go, oh, I can say this because that will show me off. Actually, even if your points aren't as great, but they are showing thought around that question, that is a lot better. So that's just from my experience.
I would also
feel,
it might be helpful to prepare for interviews, that because it seems like it comes up quite a few times, although I don't know if it will for online interviews, is giving you an actual published study and asking you to talk through that. So if you've never come across that before, which is quite likely, especially if you haven't studied psychology, and even if you have at A-level, I don't think you usually tend to get the primary sources that often. You can go on Google Scholar, I've put on the side the British Psychological Society's Research Digest. You know, they have articles on like actual published some recent psychological studies, and they'll always have the source, so you can try and find the original source for that, usually accessible on Google Scholar, and just try and get familiar with like the content and the layout of a research study, you know, the abstract, the intro, the method section, and just practice, you know, just nothing too technical, but just, you know, getting familiar with how graphs are presented and stuff, especially if you haven't done a lot of science subjects before. So I think that's just something that's overlooked, and people often especially think that the interviews will be, or just interviews at Oxford will be a lot more formal than they are, or like trying to trick you out, which is definitely not the case. I mean, my interviewer wasn't wearing shoes in our interview, and it's more kind of trying to mimic a tutorial, that idea of, you know, talking through a point and trying to see how you think. That's literally going to be how you will approach a tutorial discussion. So it's as much an opportunity for you to see if the tutorial system is one that would suit you and your style of learning, as it is a test. Obviously, it's going to form part of their decision about whether to make you an offer or not, but it really isn't trying to trick you out. And I think a lot of the questions you sometimes see that are published aren't contextualized, so it looks like a really tricky question, but they'll always, so it's be wary of finding prior interview questions online for Oxford, because usually they'll always be contextualized within a discussion. You would have been talking about a subject maybe based on something that you've put in your personal statement, and then that will lead, you know, to a chain of questions, and if, you know, that's just plucked out randomly from the conversation, that will look like a really random question, but actually they're never going to give you a question that you have no opportunity to even, you know, try and answer. And then having said that, like everyone else has said, they're not expecting you to know the answer completely anyway. It's just trying to attempt to answer it.
Yeah, and on what Corin said, and kind of also on what Staffy just said, I think probably one of the biggest problems, if not the biggest problem, I imagine that interviewers encounter is the mindset of, I need to show off all my knowledge. I need to show them that I know loads of things and I've read loads of books. And I imagine that is probably my key tip would be get out of that mindset. Go show off to your grandparents on Zoom, tell them about all the amazing things you've read, and then just get in there and answer the questions. Don't try and like show off, because the interviews really couldn't care less. That's not what Oxford's looking for. Similarly, both the interview and the personal statement, write a love letter to your subject or tell your grandparents about how much you love the subject, and get that out of the way, because again, they don't want to hear about the fact that you were born to study that subject, or how much, like, they don't want to hear you telling them how much you love the subject. Show them through the discussion that you engage with in the interview.
I had one more thought with regards to, what Safi was also saying, that interviewers are trying to help you actually because they want to see how you think. And I heard about a physics applicant who at some point got to a point where she was supposed to calculate 2 times 3, and she was like, 2 times 3, 5. And they were like, okay, are you sure? And she was like, 2 times 3, yeah, 5. And she just sort of stuck with that. And in that situation, you just know it's nerves, and she got a spot anyway, just because they obviously know she can calculate 2 times 3 is 6. So I always thought that was sort of a comforting story. And the second point I just had is that with regards to pre-rehearsed material, I think interviewers tell, and they'll switch course. This kind of happened to me because I think by coincidence, the question that was asked that they'd sort of chosen that year for that college for philosophy was something I had done in quite detailed like research. And I think within 2-3 sentences, the interviewer just noticed. He was like, oh, okay, you know this literature and you're giving this and that. Because I was lucky. And he switched immediately. He picked out a different topic from a different realm of philosophy and was like, show me how you think about this, something that I didn't know. And he didn't want to see answers that I'd read somewhere else. He wanted to see how I was approaching it with that. But I think it was good. So I don't know if that calms anyone down.
Yeah, maybe the final thing on interviews is that it is just another bit of information for us. It is not the be all and end all of your application, and it is also not the final filter. So we've done everything else, and now it's the interview, and that's the last hurdle. Everything gets put back in. And we have definitely offered places to people whose interview maybe wasn't great, but then they had fantastic TSA and fantastic contextualized grades and fantastic other stuff. So it's important that we care about it. We'd like to be able to interact with you, but at the same time, it is not the final filter. And I think that's another thing that you need to keep in mind.
There's a question that's come up on this. I'm aware that time is drifting on and I'm going to need to be away in a moment for another session, but can we send in additional reference letter? And I think it's worth saying in response to that, that if there is stuff that isn't appropriate for the school reference section of the UCAS form for whatever reason, so maybe we are the only university you've applied to that interviews, and you've got a disability issue that's going to affect how you get access to rooms in order. Now, of course, this year it's all going to be online, but that may generate its own issues as well. If there's something quite particular to the Oxford situation that you need to say, then your school or college can write an additional letter to the college that's your college of application, the one that either you've applied to, or if you were an open applicant, if you put an application and didn't name a college, your application will land with a college. They can then send an extra letter. If the extra reference is just further kind of praise of you in order to try and overwhelm the people who are selecting with a sense of how wonderful you are, don't, because it won't help. We couldn't possibly have open season on any number of references for every candidate. Think about what that extra reference will be doing. If it will be adding information, particularly information we need to know for our purposes, then yes, an extra reference is fine. If it's just another voice in the mix, then no.
Thanks, Dave. That's very clear. We are running out and we're going to close this call in 2 minutes, but I'm just going to quickly do 2 more questions, which I thought we could do quite easily. Say you're interviewing in both colleges and both colleges really rate you and both want to offer you a place. Would you end up going to your college of choice? Yes. So you'd be ending up with your first college, the college that you've chosen, if both of them say, yes, we want to offer this person a place. Sometimes you may end up actually in a completely different college if they both say, yes, this person deserves a place, but it's surplus to the number we've got, so we'll make them an open offer. They may end up going somewhere else, but typically you would be going to the college. If both rated that it would be going down.
It's probably worth clarifying that you don't have the choice after the interview. It's the choice you made on the UCAS form. So you can't go, so I was interviewed at Jesus and Worcester. I can be like, oh, I really love Worcester, which was my randomly assigned college. I want to go there. So you won't be like given a tick box afterwards. It's just what you made on your UCAS.
Yeah, on the original, indeed, the original application. And then if you're applying for linguistics and philosophy, would the interviews be done by linguistics and philosophy, or would there be psychology lecturers involved as well? Typically, no. Typically, if you go linguistics, philosophy, you'll be interviewed by linguistics and philosophy, but there may be a case that an experimental psychology tutor might sit in as well, but typically not. There's no hard limit on this answer, but
yeah, I mean, just to give an example from my college, which doesn't follow that pattern, but this answer may not carry through this year because the online interviews are going to present other challenges. We like every interview candidate to be seen by two common panels within the college. So everybody is interviewed by philosophy, everybody is interviewed by psychology. There's an EP, an experiential psychology candidate interviewed by a philosopher. So, and then those who have applied for linguistics are interviewed by linguistics too. So some people get 3 interviews, everybody gets 2. And we just think that's a good idea in order to give us 2 touch points to actually assess somebody's ability to think, which is what really the interviews are about. It's not about how much psychology do you know. Everybody's heard that already. That's not what we're about. So a philosopher who I suppose has a certain professional interest in getting people to think is going to be assessing as well. But you would at least be interviewed by philosophy and linguistics if that's what you've applied for.
Yes, maybe the at least is the ideal answer here. Okay, so it's 12 o'clock. We're going to hang up. So our students will remain online to answer questions on the Slido. So please keep on typing questions and we'll answer. But that's the end of our live stream and our seeing faces and just talking to you. Nice meeting you all virtually, although not in real life. And that's it. So thanks very much to the whole panel.
Bye.